This is Knaresborough, a lovely little market town just outside Harrogate. It's close to the cathedral cities of York and Ripon, and a stone's throw from the main East of England thoroughfare, the A1. Throughout its checkered history, this quaint little town has been intimately connected with the fates of kings and princes, radical clergy, excommunicants, assassins and rebels. Not to mention at least 2 archbishops of Canterbury. Knaresborough's Norman castle dates at least from the early 12th century and quite possibly earlier. It's built upon an easily defensible rock, which also seems to have been the site of previous Saxon and Viking fortifications. In 1369, King Edward III granted the castle and lands to John of Gaunt. And this is the part of the story we're most interested in today. It was John of Gaunt who first suggested the 14th century poll tax, an unprecedented form of taxation introduced in 1380, which ultimately led to the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. It was a tax which demanded 1 groat, or 4 pence, from every living person in England over the age of 14 years. The sum was quickly tripled to a staggering 12 pence per person, and the peasantry, still reeling from the catastrophic impact of the Black Death that hit England in 1348, simply couldn't pay. So who was this John of Gaunt who suggested the 14th century poll tax and thought he had the right to suggest taxing people for simply being people? John of Gaunt was a Plantagenet. He was the 4th son of Edward III, the Black Prince. As a royal, he put the family name and the intangible honour of sovereignty above the well-being of the people. Sound familiar? He knew the country needed money to continue its conflict with France. It was a terrible dispute involving the honour of sovereigns that would continue pointlessly and at great cost for a further 84 years. That conflict brought death, impoverishment, disease and famine to the masses, and all for the honour of a few ruling elite. Such is the legacy of the medieval 100 Years' War. Cheers, John. John of Gaunt was knighted in 1355. He was just 14 years old. At 21, he was given the Duchy of Lancaster and given the dubious distinction of being the north of England's greatest landowner. Dubious indeed, given the poverty that affected most of his fellow Englishmen. Within a year, he was the wealthiest noble in all of England, earning £12,000 in annual revenue from his Duchy of Lancaster, a vast sum in those days which far outstripped the income of any other noble nationwide. His only son, Henry Bolingbroke, was to become Henry IV in a violent coup that would eventually lead to what we now know as the Wars of the Roses. Another monarchic dispute among the entitled elite. When wealthy entitled gentry fall out, it's the working people who suffer most harshly. Over the next 3 decades, an estimated 105,000 Englishmen were hacked to death on various domestic battlefields. If that doesn't sound like very many to modern ears, bear in mind it represented a little over 5%, or 1 in 20 of the total population. About 1 in 8 of the fighting-age menfolk, more when you discount the multitudinous clergy who rarely found themselves in the way of sword and arrow. The dead were fathers, workers, brothers, breadwinners and labourers. The impact upon working people was catastrophic. Ordinary people killing each other just because a few toffs can't decide who will exploit the people next. The crown changed hands fully 7 times during the 30 years from 1450, with no discernible change in the lot of the peasantry, whichever monarch was in charge. As always, working people died, and the elite kept on exploiting them just the same. And let's not forget the modern version of this, with both Margaret Thatcher and Tony Blair sending our troops to war at the cost of countless British and foreign lives to maintain their own hold on the reins of power. Even as I speak these words, Prime Minister Boris Johnson is rattling his sabre at Russia in a bid to rouse the gammon to patriotic fervour and save his own beleaguered career.
Last week, the UK acted to strengthen Ukraine's ability to defend her soil by supplying anti-armour missiles and deploying a small training team of British personnel. In addition, the British Army leads the NATO battle group in Estonia, and if Russia invades Ukraine, we would look to contribute to any new NATO deployments to protect our allies in Europe.
But all that's for the future. For now, we're interested in John of Gaunt and his bright new idea of a poll tax. The tax was universal, which meant everyone paid and there was no gradation. Everyone paid the same, just as they do today with VAT, a tax which, as a percentage of purchasing power, also hits the poorer far harder than the wealthy. In the aftermath of the Black Death, which had first hit England in 1348, a shortage of tenants and workers had seen massive rises in rents and an ever-increasing cost of living, which, whilst some profited, had left many having to do without long before the poll tax came into force.
That's why the modern Tory party's joyous decision to stick VAT on energy bills while so many continue to have to choose between heating and eating is seen as so unfair to modern Brits. It takes no account of earnings and so hits everyone equally hard.
Even those who already have to choose between heating and eating. Just like VAT on fuel, the 14th century poll tax included those who couldn't work, those who had become too old to work, and those who had no income at all. But then, a rich landowner like John of Gaunt wouldn't be terribly keen on making himself pay more than he had to, just as the likes of Rees-Mogg today wouldn't want to bring his dosh back from the Cayman Islands to pay tax like the ordinary people of UK. Nothing changes. About 20 miles or so from Knaresborough is the village of Hipswell, birthplace of radical preacher, reformer and Bible translator John Wycliffe, who in 1381 gave a sermon exposing the injustice with an obvious rhetorical parody of the Lord's Sacrament.
Wycliffe argued that lords do wrong to poor men by unreasonable taxes, and they perish from hunger and thirst and cold, and their children also, and in this manner the lords eat and drink poor men's flesh and blood. Wycliffe's words had a strong influence on another clergyman, John Ball, who subsequently went around preaching that the tax was unreasonable and should not be paid. Ball was another Yorkshireman, this time from St Mary's in York itself, just a few miles from Knaresborough.
Ball, together with Wat Tyler, a man eventually destined to lead the whole endeavour, organised the Peasants' Revolt in 1381. Ball had been chaplain of St James's in Colchester until 1466, when he was excommunicated by the Archbishop of Canterbury, Simon Sudbury, for preaching against the wealthy elite and their exploitation of the poor. So incensed was Archbishop Sudbury in April of 1381 that he actually had Ball imprisoned in Maidstone in Kent because of his anti-Christian views about fairness and non-exploitation of the peasants. It was the peasants themselves who stormed the prison and freed him.
The call to arms began in Brentwood in Essex. In May 1381, Thomas Bampton, the king's emissary, had been chased out of Brentwood by an angry mob who refused to cooperate in rooting out poll tax evaders. The king's government, in their arrogance, thought this an isolated incident, a small riot that could easily be crushed with force by the king's soldiers, as an example to other potential malcontents. But they were wrong. Thomas Baker, the ringleader of the Brentwood rioters, lost no time in raising an army of his own. He drew together armed men from the surrounding villages and, together with Ball and Tyler, began planning a much larger insurrection. The soldiers sent to stamp out dissent in Essex were ambushed by a well-organised and prepared group of defenders, and they too were sent packing, along with the keeper of the king's peace, who accompanied them. The fuse of insurrection had very definitely been lit, and for the peasants, there really was no way back. Using a network of village leaders orchestrated by men on horseback, the rebels were able to pull together some 50,000 peasants from all around the home counties and beyond. Within their ranks were veterans of the wars with France, equally impoverished since their return from the fray. They were just as motivated to overthrow the poll tax and far more experienced and tactically skilled than many of the soldiers they were preparing to face. In June 1381, they marched on London. Here their numbers were swelled by between 40 and 50,000 Londoners who also hated the new tax. They, like the newcomers, persuaded even by their rebellious preachers to love the monarch, believed that the young king, Richard II, would be sympathetic to their plight and reject the advice of his uncle, John of Gaunt. But that was not to be. 15-year-old Richard II, like the rest of the elite, saw no reason to concern himself with the hardship of the masses. Like John of Gaunt, like the modern government led by Johnson, he saw the hoi polloi merely as resources to be exploited.
He saw people as a means to an end. He didn't see their quality of life as an end in itself. Richard listened to the peasants' demands at Mile End and appeared to be sympathetic. After all, he wasn't prepared to deal with such a massive group of the great unwashed appearing in his capital. He'd issued orders for his army of 20,000 to return from Scotland and the north, where they'd been suppressing incursions, but they weren't able to get there in time. Their commander, our old friend John of Gaunt, may well have been fortunate to be in the north at the time. He was the figure the peasants hated the most, and it's almost certain that had he been in London at the time, he'd have lost his life, along with several others responsible for the increasing poverty of the people. So, Richard agreed to all the demands put to him, including the end of the poll tax and of all feudal services, the freedom to buy and sell their own goods, limits on what landlords could charge for rent and proper contracted working conditions, rent limits of 4 pence per acre, and an end to feudal fines in the manorial courts. Tyler also demanded equality before the law and an end to church involvement in public legislation, what we now describe as the separation of church and state. Richard's promise was enough for most of the peasants, who promptly returned home, confident that they'd achieved their aims without too much bloodshed, although there was a fair bit of killing en route to London. Unbeknown to anyone at the meeting, though, another group of rebels had stormed the Tower of London, executed Robert Hales, the king's treasurer, and they'd also taken the head of Simon Sudbury, the Archbishop of Canterbury. It had been Sudbury who had imprisoned John of Gaunt and opposed Wycliffe's sermons on the poll tax. What Tyler wasn't so sure of the king's fidelity, and so, along with some 300 armed men, he remained in London, waiting to see if the king would make good on his promise to prosecute the corrupt officials who'd made the poll tax problems worse by creaming off some of the revenue for themselves. Needless to say, the word of the monarch was about as good as the sincerity of Boris Johnson today. Just like Boris, Richard reneged on every promise he'd made to the people. Richard arranged another meeting, a private one with Tyler, on June the 15th at Smithfield, and the rebel leader was wounded while resisting arrest and then beheaded. Next, Walworth, the Lord Mayor of London, persuaded the peasants that Tyler had actually been knighted and would meet them further outside the city. That done, he roused all the loyal Londoners he could muster, told them the rebels were attacking the king, and marched against the revolters.
Then, Thomas Woodstock, John of Gaunt's younger brother, took a detachment into Essex and routed the remaining rebels, killing many at Billericay before chasing the rest to Ramsey Abbey in Cambridgeshire, where they too were summarily dispatched. On July the 2nd, just days after agreeing to the rebels' terms, King Richard issued a decree denouncing all his concessions and forbidding any use of his royal name in connection with the peasants' demands. On July 15th, by order of the King's courts, John Ball, the radical preacher and excommunicant, was hanged, drawn and quartered, exactly 1 month after the betrayal and murder of Wat Tyler at Smithfield.
But, as will undoubtedly happen to Boris, Richard's treacherous ways eventually caught up with him. In 1399, following the death of John of Gaunt, King Richard confiscated Knaresborough Castle, thus disinheriting Henry, John of Gaunt's son. It was this that caused Henry to rebel against the king and ultimately depose him and behead him.
As we look at history and the way it repeats itself, it's unfortunate that, as Spanish philosopher George Santayana wrote, those who cannot remember the past are doomed to repeat it.
As we think of the history and biographies of not only of Boris and his vicious brood of ministers and MPs, but also of the Conservative Party itself, it's hard to understand just how easily British people forgot their abuses of the masses since the party's inception in 1834. Their opposition to the NHS, their introduction of unfair taxation, including their own version of the poll tax, the way they wasted billions of public money on spurious contracts for their friends and donors whilst ordinary people died, just as surely as the peasants on a medieval battlefield. Their destruction of British industry, their perennial defunding of public services, their reduction in legal aid, denying all people access to law, and their opposition to basic human rights. It's time to make a change. Let's learn from history, even recent history. Let's do something about the shortages, the rising unemployment, the 150,000 COVID deaths to date, and the way the Tories have attacked freedom of speech and the right to protest. The callous lies they've told just to protect their own necks at the expense of the country and the people. I'm not advocating revolution. Revolts like that of 1381 never end well. In times of revolution, the victor tends to be the most ruthless, and that's not who you want in charge. What I suggest is this. The very next chance we get, vote. Vote these bastards out. And we can begin rebuilding this country as a serious player on the world stage instead of the little insignificant sweatshop for Tory profit. Let's show this corrupt, lying bunch of scumbags that there really is a better way to do politics that doesn't involve their sleaze and callous disregard for their fellow human beings. Do the right thing. You know you want to. Vote them out.